The rain came down in steady sheets, tapping against the wide hospital windows in a soft, rhythmic cadence. It wasn't a storm, the kind that rattled walls or filled parking lots with floodwater, but a quiet, persistent drizzle that made everything feel slower, older. In the heart of Portland, Oregon, the night shift at Willamette Mercy Hospital had settled into its usual hush. Machines hummed in the background, nurses moved with practiced precision, and the lights above the long corridor glowed a warm, dull amber, just enough to see, never enough to comfort. Emily Carson, 31, moved through those halls with quiet grace. Her navy scrubs were still crisp despite the 12-hour shift. A lanyard hung from her neck, her ID badge swaying as she walked. Her hair was pulled back in a clean ponytail, but a few wisps had come loose, brushing the curve of her cheek. She didn't notice. She rarely did anymore. To anyone watching, she looked composed, maybe even content. But inside, there was a stillness in her that had nothing to do with exhaustion. It was the kind of stillness that comes after too many goodbyes, after too many promises break under pressure. Her parents had died in a car crash when she was just out of nursing school. And 2 years after that, the man she planned to marry left her a week before their wedding, with nothing more than a voicemail and a shared apartment full of reminders. Since then, Emily had made peace with solitude. She didn't fear being alone. What she feared was feeling unseen. Her shift was almost over when Gina, one of the senior nurses, passed by, clutching a clipboard. "You're off at 11, right?" she asked casually. Emily nodded. "Yeah, just finishing up in room 210. Mr. Blake." Gina paused. "He's still refusing food?" Emily gave a small smile. "He's refusing more than just food." Room 210 sat tucked at the end of the hallway, where the lights dimmed even more and the silence grew heavy. Inside lay Franklin Blake, an 85-year-old man recovering from a rough case of bronchitis. His chart said he had 3 grown children, all of whom lived out of state. The reality? No one had visited since he'd been admitted 4 days ago. When Emily entered, she didn't say anything at first. She moved quietly, checking his IV, adjusting the nasal cannula feeding him oxygen. Franklin was awake, his tired blue eyes locked on the raindrops racing down the window pane. He didn't look at her, didn't need to. She'd been there enough times to know he preferred silence over small talk. "You again," he rasped, voice dry as dust. She smiled gently. "Afraid so. Night crew's a little short tonight. Guess you're stuck with me." He didn't respond. She moved toward the tray of food untouched on the rolling table. "You haven't eaten since yesterday morning, Mr. Blake. You've got to keep your strength up." Still no reply, just the sound of rain and machines. She didn't push. Instead, she pulled the visitor chair a little closer and sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "You know," she said softly, "when my mother was in hospice, she hated being alone at night. She said it felt like the world had forgotten her once the sun went down." Franklin's eyes shifted, just slightly. Emily continued, her tone still soft. "So I stayed. Every night, sometimes I'd read, sometimes I'd sing, sometimes we just listened to the quiet." He turned his head a little. "You sing?" "A little," she said with a shrug. "Badly, but yes." He gave a grunt that might have been a laugh, might have been a cough. Hard to say. "I could sit here with you for a while," she offered gently, "just until you fall asleep." He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. But when she reached for the spoon and gently lifted it toward his mouth, he opened it. Just like that, something shifted. The next night, the rain had softened, but the chill in the air lingered. Emily didn't have to be there. Her shift had ended an hour ago, and technically, her obligation to room 210 ended with it. But obligations had never been what kept her in the hospital after hours. Some people stayed for overtime. Others stayed for ambition. Emily Carson stayed for the ones who had no one else. She walked into Franklin Blake's room just as the night nurse was finishing the routine vitals. The lights were low, casting soft shadows along the wall. Franklin was awake, propped up slightly with a fresh pillow. His eyes met hers just briefly. "I figured you went home," he said hoarsely. "I did," Emily lied with a smile, "but my takeout got cold, and you're better company than an empty apartment." He gave her a look, half skepticism, half amusement. He didn't press the issue. She pulled the visitor's chair closer again, settling into a familiar rhythm as she adjusted the blanket that had slipped down past his knees. For a few moments, neither of them said a word. The silence didn't feel awkward. It felt earned. Then quietly, Franklin spoke. "You said your mother was in hospice." Emily nodded. "She was. Stage 4 ovarian cancer. She fought hard, but by the time she was admitted, there wasn't much left to fight with." Franklin's voice rasped like dry leaves. "Did she go peacefully?" Emily's throat tightened. "Because of a nurse, yes." Franklin looked over at her again. "Someone like you?" She smiled faintly. "Exactly like me. Older, silver hair, hands that smelled like peppermint. She used to rub my mother's back when the pain got too much. She never asked for thanks. She just showed up." Franklin didn't reply right away. Then with a sigh, he said, "That's rare these days." She nodded slowly. "It is." A long pause, then he asked, "You always stay after hours for people like me?" Emily shook her head. "Not for people like you, just for you." That startled something in him, a faint tremor in the chin, a quick glance away toward the window. Emily reached for the spoon again, this time with practiced ease. "Let's try a little more dinner tonight. You did well yesterday." He gave a reluctant nod. "All right, but only if I get to complain about the peas." She chuckled. "Deal." As she fed him small, careful bites, she noticed the faint tension in his shoulders ease. His body, once stiff and guarded, now moved with less resistance. When he finished half the tray, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly. Franklin raised a bushy gray eyebrow. "You've already asked plenty." "This one's different." He gave a short nod. "Do you ever think about things you didn't say when you had the chance?" Franklin stared ahead, the rain painting streaks down the glass beyond his bed. "All the time," he said at last. "I was good at building things. A house, a business, a future. But I was terrible at saying the simple stuff." "Like what?" He turned his head toward her. "Like, I'm sorry, or I'm proud of you, or just, I love you. My wife used to say men are taught how to work hard, but not how to feel out loud." Emily leaned in, voice barely a whisper. "But maybe it's not too late to say the things that matter." His eyes held hers a moment longer than usual. Then, almost inaudibly, he said, "I have a son. Haven't spoken in 6 months. Maybe more. We stopped keeping track. Do you want to speak to him again?" "I don't know if he'd listen." She hesitated. "Then maybe I can listen until he's ready." For the first time since she'd met him, Franklin looked like he might cry, but instead he blinked hard and looked away. Emily reached for his hand, cold, fragile, but still strong in its own way. She wrapped hers around it gently. "I used to hum to my mom when she couldn't sleep," she said softly. "Would it be all right if I did the same for you?" He didn't answer, but his eyes fluttered shut. So she did. A wordless lullaby, the same one her mother once whispered to her in the small farmhouse kitchen, humming over the sound of boiling water and ticking clocks. A tune that had no beginning, no lyrics, and no name, only feeling. As she sang, Franklin's breathing slowed, the tension in his forehead smoothed. The silence in the room wasn't empty now. It was full of something unspoken, but understood. Emily stayed long after the lullaby faded, not because she was told to, not because anyone would know, but because no one should fall asleep alone, with only regrets for company. The next morning, the hospital corridors buzzed faintly with the quiet rhythm of daybreak. Rolling carts, murmured check-ins, and coffee cups cradled in tired hands. But down one hall, just past the nurse's station and around the corner from room 210, a man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out of the elevator with a look that didn't belong in a hospital at all. Daniel Blake was 42, polished and precise, the kind of man whose shirts were always pressed and whose watch always matched his shoes. CEO of a software firm in Seattle, he had grown used to boardrooms and investor calls, not long, sterile corridors, or the faint scent of antiseptic in the air. He hadn't planned to come. Truth be told, he almost hadn't. The call came 2 days ago. "Your father's in the hospital. Bronchitis, possibly pneumonia. No one's been by." Daniel had stared at the message for a long time before finally replying with a single sentence. "I'll be there Tuesday." He told himself it was out of duty. Respectability. A name still carried weight, especially his father's. Franklin Blake may have been distant, critical, even cold, but he was still Daniel's father. Room 210 was at the far end of the hall. As Daniel approached, his pace slowed. The door was slightly ajar. He reached for the handle, but then paused. Through the narrow window in the door, he saw something that stopped him cold. His father was lying in bed, eyes closed, breathing even, peaceful, and beside him sat a woman, young, in scrubs, her auburn hair tucked behind her ears. She wasn't doing anything grand or performative. She wasn't speaking or charting notes or moving around the bed like most nurses did. She was simply sitting. Her hand was resting lightly over his, and from her lips came the softest, most unexpected sound. A hum, a lullaby. Daniel stood frozen. That humming, it did something to the air. It softened the corners of the room. It touched something in him he hadn't felt since he was a boy. His father looked calm, gentler. No scowl, no biting remarks, just stillness. It unsettled him, not in a bad way, but like a memory stirred from too long ago. Daniel stepped back from the door. He didn't go in. He couldn't. He turned and walked back down the hall, his shoes clicking lightly against the polished tile. When he reached the elevator, he caught his reflection in the brushed metal doors. The man who looked back at him wore a $1,000 suit, cufflinks engraved with his initials, and a look of quiet control. But beneath that was something else, a crack, a question, a longing. That nurse, whoever she was, had managed in one night to reach a version of his father Daniel hadn't seen in decades, and that shook him more than he cared to admit. That afternoon he returned. He told himself it was to check on progress, talk to the attending physician, review medications and options. That's what a good son would do, right? But the truth hung between every step he took. He didn't come back for charts. He came back to see her. She was at the nurse's station, flipping through patient files and scribbling notes. When she passed by room 210, she paused to wave politely. Not a flirt, not a move, just kindness, recognition. She didn't know who he was, not yet. Daniel found himself watching her more than he expected to. He noticed how she spoke to patients, not to the illness, but to the person beneath it. She knelt beside wheelchairs. She remembered names, allergies, favorite drinks. She adjusted pillows like it mattered, not just for comfort, but for dignity. He stayed longer than planned that day. His father barely said a word, but he didn't resist Daniel's presence. When Emily stopped by with evening meds, Franklin didn't grimace or growl. He just nodded. Later that evening, Daniel caught her by the vending machine. She was pouring black coffee into a styrofoam cup, her shoulders slightly hunched from the weight of a long shift. "You're the one who's been sitting with my father," he said gently. She turned. "You're Mr. Blake's son." He nodded. "Daniel," she offered a quiet smile. "Emily." They shook hands. Hers was warm, worn from work, but steady. He hesitated, then asked, "Why do you do it? Stay after hours? Sit with him?" Emily didn't blink. "Because no one else does." He looked at her differently then, like someone seeing a stranger become familiar. "He was always hard to reach," Daniel said, almost to himself. She nodded. "I know, but he listens when you're in the room." That caught him off guard. "I didn't say anything." "You didn't have to." He didn't say more. Neither did she. But something passed between them in that pause. A recognition, not just of who they were to Franklin, but of what they were becoming to each other. Daniel returned the next day, and the day after that. He didn't tell anyone at work. He rescheduled meetings, canceled a lunch with a potential investor, and took early morning flights back to Seattle when necessary. Then he'd return by evening, always alone, always quiet. Franklin said very little. Sometimes just a grunt. Sometimes a single sentence that made no sense. But something had shifted. He no longer turned away when Daniel entered the room. His eyes no longer held the same sharpness of distrust. And Emily was always there. Not hovering, not overstepping, just present. Daniel watched her with quiet interest. She had a way of moving through a space like she belonged to it, not with ownership, but with presence. She greeted each patient with the same soft voice. She remembered details. Who liked crushed ice in their water? Who preferred the blinds open at sunrise? Who had trouble sleeping if their pillow wasn't fluffed twice? They crossed paths more now, in the hallway at the nurse's station, by the coffee cart on the ground floor. And every time it felt less like coincidence and more like something they were slowly building without saying the words aloud. One afternoon, Daniel leaned against the vending machine, watching as she fished a packet of almonds from the bottom tray. "Do you ever sleep?" he asked, teasing gently. She smiled without turning around. "Sometimes, usually between 2 and 4 a.m., with my shoes still on. You're always here. Most days." He took a sip of his coffee. "He likes you, you know. My father. More than most people." Emily turned to face him. "It's not about being liked. It's about being there." Daniel nodded. "You're good at that." There was a pause, then, in a quieter voice, he said, "I wasn't." Emily tilted her head. "You're here now." He chuckled dryly. "Yeah, after 15 years of being everywhere else." She didn't say anything. Just let the silence settle, the way she often did with Franklin. Eventually she asked, "What happened between you two?" Daniel hesitated, then exhaled, long and low. "My mom died when I was 12. She had a stroke, quick, brutal. He changed overnight, went from being a little distant to, well, completely unreachable. Stopped talking about her, worked longer hours, bought a second house. I think it was his way of pretending the hole wasn't there." Emily's expression softened. "I tried for a while. Good grades, college, awards. Thinking maybe he'd see me. Maybe he'd say something that made me feel chosen." He looked away, but it never came. She leaned back against the wall beside him. "That's a heavy thing to carry." He nodded. "Eventually I stopped trying, moved out, built a life on my own terms. It worked. Mostly." "Mostly?" He met her eyes. "Until I saw you sitting by his bed." Emily said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was safe space. Daniel looked down at the coffee in his hands. "I've spent my entire adult life building things. Companies, portfolios, legacies. But that night you made me realize I never built peace. Not with him, not with myself." Emily's voice was gentle. "Peace doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's just showing up." He smiled slightly. "That seems to be your specialty." Their conversation was interrupted by a call from down the hall. Emily squeezed his arm gently before stepping away. "Room 213 needs pain meds. I'll see you later." Daniel watched her go, feeling something stir in his chest, an ache he hadn't named yet. Later that night, as visiting hours ended and Emily checked Franklin's vitals, Daniel lingered in the hallway. She came out quietly, her expression soft. "He asked if you were coming back tomorrow." Daniel's eyes widened. "He did?" She nodded. "That was all he said. Just, is he coming back?" Something broke open in him. He looked down, lips parting slightly in disbelief. "He hasn't asked about me in years." Emily stepped closer. "Then maybe this is the beginning." Daniel swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. "He doesn't say much, but when you're in the room, he's different." "So are you," she replied gently. He looked at her. The hallway light caught her features, warm and calm, like a memory he didn't know he needed. "Do you ever wonder why certain people cross our paths?" "All the time," she whispered. Daniel didn't reach for her hand, but he wanted to. Not yet, but soon. And in that quiet space between grief and healing, between strangers and something more, a seed had been planted. Not of romance, not yet, but of recognition. That maybe the people who find us in our most broken places aren't there to fix us. Maybe they're just there to stay. That night, the hospital was quieter than usual. Even the machines seemed to hum at a softer volume, as if the building itself sensed something sacred in the air. Most visitors had gone home. The nurses moved gently, like shadows on a dim stage. Emily stood outside room 210, reading the latest chart note. Vitals steady, appetite improved slightly, oxygen levels holding. It was a small win. But in the world of end-of-life care, small wins were everything. She stepped inside with practiced ease, carrying a fresh pitcher of water and a blanket warmed in the linen dryer. Franklin was awake, propped up a little more than usual. His eyes found her the moment she entered. Not sharp, not guarded, just present. "You came back," he said quietly. She smiled. "You say that like you're surprised." He didn't reply. Just let her tuck the blanket around his legs and adjust the pillow behind his head. She sat beside him again, this time without asking permission. He didn't protest. Outside, the Oregon rain had started again, tapping gently against the window. Soft, steady, familiar. After a long silence, Emily spoke. "You know, I wasn't going to ask, but I've noticed something." Franklin raised an eyebrow. "Your son," she said gently. "When he walks into the room, your whole face changes." Franklin blinked, then looked away. "It's been a long time." "I know, but I think he's trying." "He always tried," Franklin muttered. "Even when I didn't." Emily didn't push. She waited. "He was a good kid," Franklin said at last. "Bright, curious, sensitive, though I never said that like it was a good thing. After his mother passed, I didn't know what to do with a boy who cried in his sleep." Emily's chest ached. "I thought keeping him strong meant keeping my distance. I taught him discipline, responsibility, but I never told him he was enough. Not once." She reached for his hand, thin, pale, with skin like paper. "Maybe he's still waiting to hear it." Franklin swallowed hard. His eyes glistened in the dim light. "I don't know if I can." "Then just start with what's true." There was silence again, long but not empty. Unbeknownst to either of them, Daniel stood just outside the door. He had come back late after a conference call, planning to stop by quickly and head home. But when he approached the room, he heard Emily's voice. He stopped short. Something in her tone made him stay, made him listen, and then he heard his father speak the words he'd waited decades to hear. "I should have said I was proud of him, that he didn't have to earn it, that he already was." Emily's voice trembled slightly. "He still might need to hear that." Franklin's next words came softer, halting. "I was afraid that if I said it out loud, it would make my grief real. And I didn't know how to carry both love and loss at the same time." "You don't carry them," Emily whispered. "You let them carry you." Inside the room, Franklin's breathing deepened. Outside, Daniel pressed his back against the cool wall, blinking away tears that came too fast to stop. He had heard more in the past 5 minutes than in a lifetime of strained dinners and cold holidays. He had come here thinking there was nothing left between them but duty. But in Emily's presence, in the grace of her listening, his father had found the courage to speak again, to feel again. And Daniel? He had found something else, a witness, a bridge. Someone who didn't just soften his father, but softened him too. Later that night, Emily stepped out of room 210 and nearly ran into Daniel. She gasped softly. "I didn't know you were here." His eyes were red, but his smile was real. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop." She tilted her head. "But I'm glad you did." He nodded. "You have a way of bringing out the things I thought were gone for good." Emily didn't answer right away. Her voice, when it came, was quieter. "Sometimes all someone needs is for us to stay long enough to hear what they're too scared to say." Daniel looked at her like he was seeing the world through a window that had just been cleaned. "You didn't just help him, Emily. You helped me." Their eyes met. There was no kiss, no dramatic confession, just a long look, heavy with everything unsaid, but deeply understood. And for the first time in his adult life, Daniel Blake didn't feel like a son who had failed. He felt like a son who had been found. Franklin Blake passed away 3 weeks later, quietly, gently, the way autumn leaves fall when no one is watching. Emily was there, sitting beside his bed as she had so many nights before. She hummed the same wordless lullaby, her hand resting lightly over his frail one. No machines beeped, no last-minute panic, just the fading breath of a man who had finally laid down everything he had carried too long. When the monitor flatlined, Emily didn't flinch. She just closed her eyes and whispered, "You weren't alone." Later, Daniel came to the hospital, His suit was darker than usual, his face drawn but steady. When Emily met him in the hallway, she didn't speak. She didn't have to. He wrapped his arms around her for the first time. Not out of romance, but out of grief, out of gratitude, out of everything that words had never been enough to say. The funeral was small, just as Franklin had requested. No speeches, no grandeur. Just a few retired colleagues, some hospital staff, and two people who had walked with him to the very end. After the service, while others lingered by the floral arrangements or murmured quiet condolences, Emily found herself standing under a large oak tree at the edge of the cemetery. Her coat was buttoned to the top. The wind moved her hair across her cheek. She hadn't cried much, not in the way others might. Her grief came in stillness, in memory. She had already filed the transfer paperwork, a different hospital, a quieter wing. She hadn't told Daniel yet, but before she could walk away from the tree, she heard footsteps in the grass. "Is it true?" Daniel's voice was low but steady. "You're leaving?" Emily nodded without turning around. "I thought it might be easier for everyone." "For who?" he asked. "Not for me." She exhaled. "I blurred lines I wasn't supposed to. I stayed too long, felt too much." He stepped in front of her, his expression soft but searching. "Emily, you were the only thing my father left me that I didn't expect. The only thing I didn't know I needed." Her eyes welled. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of loving the right person too late." Daniel reached for her hand, not urgently, but with care. "You're not late," he said. "You're here. So am I. And maybe that's enough to start something." That day, Emily didn't give an answer. Not right away, but she didn't leave. And over the weeks that followed, they talked. Sometimes about Franklin, sometimes about childhood, sometimes about nothing at all. They shared walks, meals, silences. They learned how to trust the quiet. A year later, under the soft spring sun in a garden behind a long-term care center, Emily stood beside Daniel at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Franklin Blake Foundation. The foundation didn't focus on medicine. It focused on presence, end-of-life companionship, memory care with dignity, programs that honored not just the body, but the soul. Daniel didn't give a long speech that day. He just said, "My father died in peace because someone saw him when no one else did." This is our way of seeing others. As applause echoed gently through the courtyard, Daniel turned to Emily. His eyes held a different kind of certainty now, not the kind that came from business deals, but from choosing to stay. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a simple ring and an old yellowed note in Franklin's handwriting. "If my son loves this woman," the note read, "then she must be someone who teaches men how to feel again. Give her this not as a promise for me, but as a blessing for both of you." Emily looked up, eyes full. Daniel knelt, voice trembling slightly. "You didn't just heal him, Emily. You healed me. And if you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life learning how to love the way you do." She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes, 1,000 times." And in that small garden where silence once lived, something new began. Not perfect, but true. Because love, like healing, sometimes arrives quietly, but it always stays. In a world that moves quickly, where success is measured in numbers and relationships are often filtered through screens, it's easy to forget the quiet power of presence. The story of Emily and Daniel reminds us that healing doesn't always come through doctors, procedures, or medication. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a soft voice at your bedside, a hand held without asking, a stranger who chooses to stay when no one else will. Many of us carry regrets, words we never said, people we drifted from, love we held back out of fear or pride. But as Franklin Blake's story shows us, it's never too late to try. Even a man who spent years locked inside his grief was able to reach for peace in the final chapter of his life, because someone was patient enough to listen and kind enough to stay. We're reminded that every person, no matter how distant or hardened they may seem, carries a story. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to sit quietly beside them for that story to unfold. This story also teaches us that love can find its way back to us, even after great loss. For those who believe their chance at love or connection has passed, Emily and Daniel's journey offers hope. It tells us that when we open our hearts, not to fix or rescue, but simply to understand, remarkable things can grow. So whether you're a nurse, a parent, a son, a widow, or simply someone walking through a season of silence, remember this: presence matters, kindness heals, and it's never too late to begin again.